Welcome to the Joy Lab podcast, where we help you uncover and foster your most joyful self. Your hosts, Dr. Henry Emmons and Dr. Amy Prasek, bring you the ideal mix of soulful and scientifically sound tools to spark your joy, even when it feels dark. When you're ready to experiment with more joy, combine this podcast with the full Joy Lab program over at joylab.coach.
Hello, I'm Henry Emmons.
And I'm Amy Prasek. So welcome to Joy Lab. We focus on our elements of joy over here. Those are the positive emotions and inner states that become the building blocks for a joyful life. And we're building up our element of curiosity in this episode. So in episode 3, we really got into the basics of curiosity for mental health. So be sure to check out that one as well if you haven't yet. And today we want to get into a few ideas that are essential for curiosity and are super important for mental health. And these ideas around curiosity are intellectual humility, admitting that you're wrong or might be wrong. And the second is uncertainty tolerance, gaining comfort with uncertainty. But before we get into those constructs and some common obstacles and how we can overcome those obstacles, I thought Henry and I could first share how good we are at admitting that we're wrong. So Henry, right off the gate, I want to ask you, how are you with this? Maybe, how it's changed throughout the years, and either, your experience with being wrong or your uncertainty tolerance.
Nice setup. I love this. Well, I should probably admit right off the bat that I am, and I think I always have been, just a little bit of a perfectionist. Yeah. So I'm just going to give you a teeny recent example. I have my high school reunion this summer, and I got an email invitation with a questionnaire that we were asked to fill out. So I dutifully filled it out right away and returned it. And then I got this reply from my classmate. Congrats on being the first to respond. And I just had to laugh. And I responded back to her and said, yep, I guess I am still an overachiever. So while I don't think of myself as being intellectually arrogant, it is kind of hard for me to admit when I'm wrong, I have to say. When I look back on my education and training, and I really think a lot of people can relate to this, I think it shaped me to believe that there is a right answer and a wrong one. And then in my case, if you just weren't nearly perfect in getting the right answers, then, you're not going to get good enough grade, and maybe you won't get into med school or whatever else it is that you're trying to achieve. And then once I became a physician, the stakes of being wrong felt even higher. Like someone's life might depend on it, or you might get sued if you make a mistake. And while we clearly do have to exert great care in medicine, I think it's unrealistic and a great burden that we have so little tolerance for mistakes. Mm. So early in my career, and I think this is probably true for so many professionals, I worked so hard to try to do everything right, to follow the diagnostic and treatment guidelines to a T. So to color within the lines, so to speak. And it was really stressful. And honestly, I don't think that lends itself to giving the best patient care. So for example, the way that we in mental health use diagnoses, I think, is one way that curiosity gets smashed. There's just often the sense of certainty or a feeling of finality when certain diagnoses are made. So major depression, for example, or bipolar disorder, these are labels that tend to stick with a person. They follow them in their medical or legal records, maybe for the rest of their lives. And I think sometimes when a new provider sees that label, they sometimes shut down their curiosity about the person in front of them. They think they already know what's going on and what treatment is needed because it's kind of by the book. And yet, what we call depression, I think, can just mean a ton of different things. And the term itself doesn't really tell us much at all about what is underlying it or what would help that specific person to feel better.
Right.
So for me, there are two things that have really helped to soften this kind of mental rigidity. And one of them is simply experience. I have seen so many people over the years that I've come to understand the complexity of something like depression, or you just might say the complexity of the human condition. I just feel much more comfortable with ambiguity, with not knowing the answers, or even with allowing things to just evolve kind of organically in their own time. And then the second evolution, I would say, which has just really eased my work stress, I think it's even made work a joy to me, is that I have simply become more comfortable being myself in my work. I no longer feel a need to be somebody else, like, maybe a teacher I had, or just an imaginary ideal of a physician. I have more ease, and I think it comes from knowing and accepting myself more fully. So, what about you, Amy?
I don't know. I've never been wrong, so it's hard to connect with your story.
I think that might be true, Amy.
I'm good at faking it. No, admitting when I'm wrong has been something I've been focusing on for the last 3 or so years, particularly. I was in school for so long. I thought, geez, I should know all the answers by now. I'm thinking about standardized testing too with kids. It's sort of the message we're pounding into their growing brains. But then, I left academia and then having a kid, and I was like, oh my God, I don't know anything. So there's that. But I actually want to, share my experience with the other construct, uncertainty tolerance. You kind of highlighted that too with your growing comfort of that, Henry, with ambiguity. But it really feels really, ripe now. And I had a pretty poignant experience with this construct that really kind of shaped me. So first, I do want to note that I'll talk about suicide here. So please jump ahead a few minutes if you're not up for that today. And if you need to talk with someone, do not hesitate to reach out. You can easily text or call 988, and you can chat with someone from the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So, as I've shared on our podcast before, my family has experienced a lot of suicide. And when I was 17, my dad died of suicide. And my dad and I were super close. So this was completely earth-shattering for me. And, all the sympathy cards start pouring in. And there were 2 cards from folks at our church who wrote pretty much the identical message. I'll just paraphrase. If only your father would have believed more in Jesus, then this wouldn't have happened. And it didn't matter that all the other cards were fabulous and wonderful and kind, but those 2 caught way more of my attention. I was so mad at them for sending that message. But at the same time, amidst all the uncertainty that can come with a suicide, I kind of wanted to believe that message. Wouldn't that be great if I could make simple sense of it? And so that sciencey construct is coming up right here for me, this uncertainty threshold. And I really didn't have the tools to deal with my experience in this hurricane of uncertainty. It just absolutely overwhelmed me. And, I think we've all felt that flood when uncertainty sort of surges and fear, anxiety, and worry rise up. And we can feel vulnerable, in this base level survival sort of way, because the world just is not making simple sense or any sense at all. And we can't get to, a simple cause and effect, which can be really scary in that space. So back to my story here. Strangely enough, I stayed at that church, and an interim pastor came in for a bit who was just an absolute breath of fresh air. And I shared with him that I was struggling, particularly with my dad's death. And at that point, it had been about 3 years since he'd passed. And the pastor's response was with a lot of self-compassion, to press into the mystery. Like, what a way to put it. And he was talking about that uncertainty, and to meet it with curiosity instead of fear or rejection. And that really became my sort of rally cry, press into the mystery. And I actually refocused my undergrad work around the mind-body connection. I went to grad school with that same focus. I even went out on like this international curiosity adventure and interviewed a bunch of fascinating folks about universal values, depression, and suicide. And I even got myself stuck and interrogated in a police station in Dharamsala, India, because I wanted to interview the 17th Karmapa about depression and suicide. I think the police thought, like, why would somebody come from Minnesota just to ask these super depressing questions? They kept me there for like 9 hours in this little isolation room. I know they thought I was up to something, and I was really, and here's the conclusion I came to about my dad's death. I don't know. But in the weirdest way, that answer, I don't know, became the most comforting answer. And I think it's because, what I really did was expand my uncertainty tolerance. I pressed into that mystery, and my world absolutely opened up. My anger kind of dripped away. My depression and anxiety just couldn't take up as much space anymore. And I started to heal. And I know I always talk about the upward spiral that we leverage here in Joy Lab because I'm obsessed with it. It's true. But I think curiosity and these constructs of intellectual humility and uncertainty tolerance, they play a really big role in the upward spiral, just by their nature. They open up our world and open us up to the other elements of joy.
Yeah, I think that's such a good way to put it, that curiosity opens us up.
Yeah.
And, I want to say, Amy, that I really am so sorry that you got the sort of messages you did when you were trying to deal with such a difficult loss.
Hmm.
And, when you think about it, that search for black and white certainty, this need to know the answers, I think it's just kind of a magical attempt to keep ourselves feeling safe.
Yeah.
It's like what those people said to you after your father died, it might have been to make them feel better,
Absolutely.
Because if this kind of thing can happen to you because you're not doing things right, but it will not happen to me or my family because we are.
Right.
And it's really just a way of separating ourselves. You and your family must be doing something wrong, but I'm safe because we have the right way of thinking.
Yeah.
And that might feel comforting at the time, but I actually think it takes a ton of effort to build and maintain those walls. And they can come tumbling down really fast when something bad happens to them or their family. So in my work, I have learned that I cannot keep myself separate, really, from the people that I work with. I'm no different than they are, not really. And I fully recognize that what happens to one person can just as easily happen to me. It can happen to anyone. In some way or another, every one of us is really vulnerable. But on the flip side, every one of us also has these same opportunities to create the upward spirals that you just talked about, Amy. And look what you have done with that tragedy that happened to you. You have made a series of choices, and I'm sure you've faltered at times, but you have gradually made yourself into one of the most amazing people that I know. Mm-hmm. I mean that. And I hope everyone listening takes heart in that, because while our circumstances might look very different on the outside, we have pretty much the same makeup, much the same ability to create something really beautiful on the inside.
Yes.
And I do think it's curiosity. It's living with uncertainty, pressing into that mystery, as your pastor put it, that opens the gates for that kind of transformation. Curiosity breaks down the barriers of separation.
Yeah, that feels so on point right now, breaking down the barriers of separation. I just think we need that more than ever. I want to give a bit more information maybe on these constructs to help us make sense of them. So the first construct, intellectual humility, describes the recognition that you might be wrong about the things you believe in. We'll get into that more. And uncertainty tolerance, which is really related to intellectual humility, is the ability to tolerate or not tolerate uncertainty. And of course, there's a full spectrum within there that we work to expand. And there are also two key pieces to that. How much uncertainty can we handle, sort of that threshold, and then how we act when we hit that limit and work to reduce it. And researcher Dr. Elsie Frankel Brunswick describes that when uncertainty tolerance kind of breaks, when we hit that limit, when we feel like we need to reduce it, we can fall into some pretty destructive patterns. I've absolutely been here. I'm sure we can relate. So we really have to be aware. We have to build the skills to sort of move out of these really common patterns. And they are relying on black and white solutions, like you referred to earlier, Henry. Also making premature conclusions, kind of shutting down any other information or more in-depth thinking. And also this tendency to reject reality and sort of latch onto unqualified individuals who fan those flames of a single answer and often a single enemy. And that's where curiosity comes in as a tool to reduce uncertainty and to boost intellectual humility. And I love the way researcher Dr. Barbara Fredrickson notes. She identifies curiosity as this focused engagement, and it prompts that focused engagement that doesn't promise a single answer, but it opens us up to the possibility of growth. And with curiosity, we also gain these really important connections, these social resources, where we feel less alone. And so let's get into building these skills, really kind of maximizing the positive effects so we can avoid those destructive patterns, choose a better path, and we can really grow from the experience. And we've got 5 simple strategies that I just kind of love. I think you'll find them to be really accessible, but actually surprisingly powerful. So the first is to practice admitting you're wrong or could be wrong. And I'll add at least once per day, even if it's just to yourself, which can be a great place to start. So what would you say here, Henry? Some ideas, some ways we can practice and gain comfort admitting when we're wrong?
Well, you might not be surprised to know that I don't consider myself an expert at this at all. But I really agree with what you said about this being a practice. So if doing this is hard for you to do, think about how you learn other new skills. At first, you just aren't very good at it. You might need some coaching or some training to learn a new complicated skill. And you also need to find the courage to try it, knowing that you are going to fail, but you just need to keep doing it again and again. And before long, I think it really gets to be about repetition. If you keep doing something long enough, it gets easier, and eventually you get pretty good at it. So the other thing I'd like to say is that you can use this as another awareness practice. So, for example, you could take a moment to tune into how you feel when you try to admit that you're wrong. And it can be really, really simple. Like, right now, do I feel more open or more closed, lighter or heavier? And then you just try to keep noticing. So when that other person responds to you, how does their reaction affect you? Like, so if they soften towards you, which often happens, how do you feel then? Do you feel more open or closed at that moment? So you can become the observer of your internal experience in this ongoing experiment.
I love that awareness practice. Um, I'm I'm watching Hacks right now, if anybody else is, and I'm thinking about if I had a boss like Deborah Vance to admit a wrongdoing to. I think the idea of that strategy too is to maybe start with some less risky, like more supportive folks who can build your confidence with your admitting, when you're admitting that you're wrong. So pick some folks that like it might be easier to start with. It would be a suggestion. I want to also add some notes here to sort of calm some fears here. Like there's a lot of research that suggests if you admit to being wrong, others will not think you are less competent. They will not think you are less competent. And actually, if you admit that you're wrong, people tend to like you more. So, and that's true at work as well. Leaders are realizing, most leaders, that creating a space for folks to admit they're wrong creates a healthier, more productive culture. All right. So the second strategy I want to dig into is to challenge your perceptions, or put another way, don't believe everything you think. There's an obstacle here that often stands in the way that I want to note, and it's called naive realism. So this is the idea that we believe our perception of the world is the truth, which is really hard to hear. So doctors Chris Chabris and Dan Simons have a really famous study known commonly as the invisible gorilla study. And I'll explain this study quickly, but some of you have probably done it in high school psych class. If you haven't, I actually would encourage you to pause the podcast right now and head to the show notes for this episode. I'll put the experiment in there so you can actually, do it. It takes less than 5 minutes start to finish, even less than that. It's so worth it. And then you can pop back here and continue on. Okay, so here's the recap of the study. Participants watch a video with 6 actors in it. The actors are passing basketballs to each other. 3 actors are wearing white shirts, and then there's 3 in black. And the participants are told to silently count the number of passes just made by the actors in white t-shirts. So about halfway through the video, and this video is only a minute long, a gorilla strolls into the middle of the action, faces the camera right in the middle, and thumps its chest, and then it leaves. And the gorilla spends about 9 seconds on screen. Okay, so what do you think? Did participants see the gorilla? Henry, what do you think?
I think, how could you miss that gorilla? How could you not see it? That's
right. Yeah, that's the hypothesis. Half of the people didn't, which is wild. And if you just came back from doing the study, half of you didn't see it. It doesn't matter who you are. While we're counting those passes, we completely miss the gorilla. At least half of us do. And this study has been replicated a lot with so many different groups, genders, education levels, occupations, and even with like a red distraction as opposed to like a black gorilla. So it's not about color sort of focusing. And it's always the same. Half see it, half don't. So the conclusion here is that we miss a lot of what goes on around us, and we all have no idea we are missing so much.
Wow. But I think that this topic gives us a really nice opportunity to briefly review some things we've talked about before that come from the psychology of mindfulness. So you defined naive realism as believing that our perception of the world is true.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that sounds very close to this concept that comes from a mindfulness understanding that most of our suffering is not caused by what happens to us, but by our mental perceptions of what happens to us. So the cause of suffering, in other words, is our mental attachments. So rather than seeing the world as it is, we see it through this very personal lens. We see it how we want it to be. And when it falls short of that, which of course it's going to do, then we feel unhappy. So basically, we take things that are impersonal and we make them personal. We do that through our own thoughts. And the tighter that we cling to those thoughts, the harder it is to get ourselves out of that cycle of suffering. Now, I think an important thing to remind ourselves of in all of this is that there is a good stress and bad stress. We hear about bad stress all the time, so let's just focus on the good stuff for now. And let's talk about dopamine. So people go to great lengths to get a hit of dopamine. It is what drives, biochemically, what drives most of our addictions. And it is known as the pleasure chemical. But it is also about focus and motivation. So here's where this good stress comes in. Living with uncertainty is stressful. That's why we talk about tolerating uncertainty, because it doesn't feel good. You have to tolerate it for a while.
Right.
But when we can tolerate uncertainty and then resolve it by coming up with a solution to something, or just by allowing things to happen organically, there is a huge payoff. And we get a major hit of dopamine, which feels good, of course. But at the same time, it's doing really good things for our brains. We are wiring things together, creating new pathways, growing a more resilient brain.
Yeah, I think that last part really want to highlight, that those healthy solutions not only reduce the uncertainty, give us a dopamine reward, but they increase our tolerance for uncertainty in the future. We gain these new neural connections that strengthen our brain. So like on the other side of that, when we tuck it under the rug or self-medicate or fall into conspiracy theories or dogmatic black and white thinking, we also get that initial dopamine hit. But it's just like a numbing agent. It doesn't build a stronger brain, and the uncertainty just comes back again and again because the solution is at odds with reality. We haven't increased our uncertainty tolerance. You just can't live in that space of cycling, I think, between uncertainty and unhelpful fixes. You just hit exhaustion at some point. And on that dopamine note, actually, will link us over to this next strategy, which is to limit your Google dopamine fix, or as Henry says, limit Google slapping, which I love. So here's the practice or the challenge. When you get stumped with some trivia, like what was Dorothy's ex-husband's name on Golden Girls? When you can't remember what that answer is, do not Google or any other little piece of trivia. I repeat, do not pick up your phone or ask Alexa the answer. And what you'll do by not Googling is actually strengthen your uncertainty tolerance as you kind of just sit there with it. And you also build something called epistemic curiosity. So epistemic curiosity has to do with kind of the quest for knowledge and the skills to help you in that search, like the ability to form questions. And, if you're just asking Alexa all day, you don't have to think really much about the questions you're asking. And you generally just take in Alexa's answers, Google's answer, the top one from just one source. And that kind of constant sort of call and response just needs to be balanced. I just can't help but think of how actually my nearly 4-year-old asks questions too, like constantly. And we dig through the answers together, and she gets all kinds of possibilities to sift through that then form new questions. You can just like see her little neural pathways just, moving and growing and connecting. And there's actually some hilarious research, I think, here too, that I think parents can completely resonate with. There's a few studies with some actually large sample sizes, and they've counted the number of questions kids ask in a day. So, okay, let's guess. How many questions do a typical 3 to 5-year-old, how many questions does that age group ask in a day? What do you think, folks? Henry, you can chime in as well.
I'm gonna guess 100. 100, yeah.
About 300. Isn't that insane? And 4-year-old girls max out at about 400. And at the end of the day, I know parents were like only answering with like a silent, "Oh my God, shut up," and a verbal "because." So sorry about not Googling. I'll give a quick example that I think ties in here. It was actually about Dorothy's ex-husband. So I had a work dinner, and we were all committed to a no phone law at the table. And somehow the conversation moved to Golden Girls, which is not uncommon for me, and what Dorothy's ex-husband's name was. We need to have more dinner parties for Joy Lab, I think. But we had 3 different answers at the table, but no phone to confirm. So we asked our server. She didn't know, but she did know that another server had once come in with a Golden Girls mug. So she asked her to come over. And when she arrived, we, posed our question and what we thought the answers were. And she just like lit up. And it was because her mom was once an extra on the show, and they would watch the show together. And her mom had passed kind of recently that she shared with us. And so it was like this really fun memory that was brought up. And she told us that his name was Stan, if you were wondering. And I was right. But I could have been wrong if I was going to practice being wrong. But, if we would have Googled it, we would have never had such a special moment. We built new neural pathways, we gained more information, and we created kind of a special little connection, this social connection. I'll say maybe as well, don't let a piece of trivia keep you up at night. That's a good time to Google it. So let's do the 4th strategy here, which is exercise. Pretty simple here. Exercise increases curiosity, particularly when you exercise outside. So this doesn't have to be an intense workout. Just a walk is great, which is great exercise. And we actually have some wonderful resources for exercise and mental health at Natural Mental Health. So that's in the foundation section. You can go to the programs tab and find that on the website.
That's such a great reminder, Amy, because, in over and over in so many different aspects of health and well-being, it comes out that exercise doesn't have to be all that fancy or vigorous, just move your body, be outdoors, go for a walk, do it almost every day.
Amen.
So in the Joy Lab program, we offer several experiments for each monthly topic. And we really do try to approach them like a scientist might do. And here's what we mean by that. So first, you create a hypothesis to test. And that just means that you change one variable and you see what happens. So in this case, you bring curiosity to some situation currently in your life. So for example, your hypothesis might be, when I am curious about situation X, rather than thinking I already know what will happen, I open myself up to seeing new possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
That's your hypothesis. Then your next job as a scientist, is simply to observe what happens when you make that one change. And you try to keep an open mind without being too attached to how things turn out. And then, after observing what happens, you try to turn it into learning. See if you can use these new skills, these new insights in other life situations. So we sincerely hope that these 5 strategies help you build up your curiosity muscles, your intellectual humility, your uncertainty tolerance. And we really dig into these and a host of other strategies to thrive in your life in the Joy Lab program. So we really hope to see you there. There is one other very important instruction that we'll leave you with, and that is always be gentle with yourself. We grow not through self-improvement, but from self-acceptance.
Thank you for listening to the Joy Lab podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, visit joylab.coach to subscribe for your monthly infusion of joy and to learn more about the full Joy Lab program. Be sure to rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.